a new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SPU, don't stop. Tarkanku, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisaray district, Kacha, Sevastopol, explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. Evacuation in Crimea. The SPU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad. The headquarters of the Northern Fleet, Severomorsk nuclear submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge is damaged, meaning at least one of its supports is damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft, these are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the Ukrainka base, but at least one confirmed Tu-95 at Ukrainka has been hit. So strategic aviation, and after that, a strategic bridge. The bridge is real and has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our peninsula, Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed in principle until we liberate Crimea, or for example, until it becomes possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. Only engineering methods can be used to destroy it. That means blowing up all the pillars. There will be a lot of problems with deactivating it from its active state, but simply, for example, damaging it at this point, as it was damaged at one time by the security service, and in 2022 and in 2023, putting it out of commission for a certain period, at least for half a year. For the duration, say, of the summer campaign, that would truly and genuinely be a significant breakthrough. Moreover, a strategic strike specifically targeting the crucial Kerch Bridge is intrinsically tied to the very start of our comprehensive liberation campaign to fully deoccupy the entire Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because without question, the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There can be different mechanisms for this. To put it out of commission so that the Russians cannot transfer a sufficient number of troops to Crimea. After that, with long-range strike capabilities, using the same drones and missiles to Crimea, which is 200 to 300 kilometers away, we have the ability, almost all our equipment can reach that distance. So this is the main range for our long-range strike systems at the operational level, which are also handled by the security service. That's why I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about 100 mobile ones as well. That's why the work of the special services lies ahead. There's an enormous amount of so-called work to be done. But you could already say that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Egorovich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard a comment from Keith Kellogg. He's simply stunned. He believes that this is simply a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation in 2 components. This concerns the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located. And of course, the strategic nuclear aviation as well. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation?
Well, that means there will be a third one. If, for example, they hit a submarine, I wouldn't be surprised if a Russian submarine on the same Northern Fleet or the same Pacific Fleet gets hit. They feel far too comfortable in the seas. We've already struck Russian land positions and strategic positions, but only one naval component has been affected so far. So in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather, if you haven't noticed, military intelligence has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out an operation in Vladivostok. They've gone quiet somewhere around the Russian Pacific Fleet, and it's quite possible that yet another Russian submarine might sink. Putin, as always, will say, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? They broke up into quarks. So that could also happen. Let's wait and see. Maybe everything is still ahead of us. This is the third such serious blow, and this is the first one that was done properly. And pay attention to the number 3. Emphasize it correctly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. It is specifically the strategic bombers that make up Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal. The strike by the Maluik showed that this component no longer dominates the world. Definitely. Why? Because, well, it's some $500 drone, or a sufficient number of drones that can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. It's possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that now the era of drones has begun. The era of drones, it feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into something like this. The planet Shelizyaga. No water, no vegetation, no minerals, inhabited by robots. That is, it's inhabited by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this apocalypse could, of course, become reality, the one that was once shown in Hollywood movies. In other words, this is a real problem for all the countries in the world that have invested in strategic security mechanisms. What was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the last 100 years into something that in the end a $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds, as Malyuk demonstrated? That's why I would say that Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the pioneers at the start of a new era in security. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, drones. Drones that are capable of carrying out major tasks with minimal funding. Basically, all these strategies will eventually be destroyed. Once, if anyone remembers, Raikin, I think it was him, may he rest in peace, once said he had a great monologue about those six-story fools, the dinosaurs. Where are they now? Extinct. But the cockroach, it's been around for 3 billion years or however long, and it's still alive and well. That's more or less what the next era will be like, something along those lines. In other words, the little bugs we're talking about now, the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller, but without losing their combat effectiveness. And eventually, what will they reach? They'll reach the point that Putin once recently predicted, together with Skabiva and all that Russian propaganda crowd, Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. They laughed and laughed about combat mosquitoes, but believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes swarm into Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, or even before the Urals, I won't even mention it, there won't be a single Russian left. They'll just keep coming after them because the Russian spirit smells so strong. Oh boy, not a single one. No filter can help with that. You have to wear gas masks if you're anywhere near Russia or the Russian Federation. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd, all this Russian Federation herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away. And we've already carried out missions there before, the Reindeer, which are not far from the base, yes. So in principle, this direction is possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. But as for Vladivostok, in fact, in some ways, that's even easier. As we've mentioned ourselves, Vladivostok is part of the Green Wedge, the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians, well, people of Ukrainian descent. Genetically, for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. That's why there's a place called Chernihivka there. For example, I know this from the Airfields. Chernihivka, that's Ukraine too. Those are our people from Poltava and residents of the Chernihiv region who settled there back in the day. Naturally, their roots from India still make themselves felt. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge, our Ukrainian enclave. Yes, Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge. All the more so if, in the end, the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic is recognized, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with Japan about returning those same disputed islands, so-called disputed, but they're Japanese islands, and Sakhalin is a Japanese island too. So this is exactly the issue that needs to be resolved there. At the same time, of course, putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet, because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think our midshipmen aren't there? Yes, practically every other one has Ukrainian roots, our solid, deep-rooted genetic tree among the midshipmen. Because in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians and all the midshipmen in the Navy were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the task arises, of ensuring the survival of our nation, this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink almost the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Lenin, when you spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? For example, how significant would the destruction of a Topol or Yars be? Is that a realistic target for Ukrainian special services as well, naturally?
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, the strategic missile forces. That means there's a certain selection process for service there, and there are some aspects related to polygraph testing. So there's very strict control over this component, and it would be very difficult, for example, to somehow get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. You see, they're all pretty clumsy. They'll end up ruining them on their own. Topol is an excellent, truly excellent missile. It was first launched, I think, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. Later, the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, let's say, fundamental starting conditions were, of course, still from the Soviet Union. They had some really good stuff back then. And the missile school, especially after our Ukrainian basically put everything into the missile program, when, as the General Secretary of the Central Committee, as Khrushchev, he fulfilled this task for Brezhnev. And then again, it was the Ukrainians who refined it. So the missile topic was, of course, very seriously developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on some aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up split among different republics, most of them, by the way, were here in Ukraine. For example, the SS-18, the Satan missile, we built it ourselves at Yuzhmash. Naturally, the Topol is a successor of this kind of missile program, especially the Topol M. It's a pretty good missile. The second one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but it's basically the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. So that's already the Yars, then the Yars RS-24, and then they built the RS-26. They tried to build the so-called Rubezh, nicknamed Oreshnik. That's the Rubezh. Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. But the Sarmat still can't get its rear off the launch silos. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. So most likely this whole series of missiles is done for. In other words, they won't really have the Sarmat. They'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once its media hype dies down, people will probably forget about it, at least as far as the unified state exam is concerned. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world as well, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles with each of its 6 warheads capable of self-guidance as they are deployed. So this really is a serious problem. Although probably it's not as much of a problem for us, because these are nuclear weapons. The Russians aren't going to use nuclear weapons against us. And to fire a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at themselves would be like using a microscope to hammer a lake. So it's not really our problem. It's a problem for NATO generals, for those guys. The Chinese, in other words, these are long-range means of destruction. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders, KN-23s, and Kinjal missiles. That is aeroballistic missiles that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy Russia's hydrogen industry, because everything is based on something. It runs on diesel, on gasoline, it flies on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon industry needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the security of the Russian hydrocarbon sector, so this is where the problem lies. It's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have set up serious production of these missiles by now, but we still haven't seen them yet. Well, we hope that eventually we'll get them, our own ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. So first, we need to destroy their hydrocarbons, all Russian oil refineries, everything related to fuel production. And second, of course, is air defense, increasing the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot and TSMT. There is no third option.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation, then blew up, the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, it exists within the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation now? Last night there were explosions, and during the day, explosions continue in Crimea. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, they packed Crimea like sardines in a can with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian livestock in Crimea. Naturally, they also crammed in military facilities there for almost 11, now 12 years practically. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was stationed there. We allowed them to do so, well, mainly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end they lost Crimea in the first place, allowing its loss back in 2014. So a very large number of Russian civilian invaders, they are indeed civilian invaders, and it's important to understand this. None of the established conventions truly apply to them, but they, unfortunately, do not fully comprehend that. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that protect civilians apply to them. That is naturally for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in Crimea is actually not that difficult. Why? Because Crimea itself is an enclosed space squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it's practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only two entry and exit points, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it's towards Melitopol, you're right, through Henikesk, those are the routes. That's why for us, it's important that when liberating Ukraine, we start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare, for example, the balance of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbass, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbass. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply asking to be the first, the very first, to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms for this. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. A railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch Bridge, the entire Kerch system, the Kerch Bridge system. And without question, all of them, all 5 of these bridges, need to be destroyed in this regard. The second bridge nearby, next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge among the general ones is the so-called sea bridge. That is to say, these are precisely the same BDKs, which are large landing ships, and they can be effectively utilized as ferries between various ports, for example, from the Russian Black Sea coast directly to our Crimean Peninsula. There are still several large landing ships left. The Russians can use them to transport a fairly large amount of weaponry with significant tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and basically the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches running there, both highways and railways, railway lines. So, of course, these can be targeted starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through Mius, and then across the bridges over the Kalmios. But realistically for us, it's very close, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And basically, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happened simultaneously on both the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely on the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, you cut off the supply systems, and then you hit them with long-range strike capabilities, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones once a week for Crimea. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. And the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike capabilities, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, 6 months or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used against military targets in Crimea. And only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient amount of aviation units to provide support specifically for the ground operation. Well, of course, we'll keep harassing Crimea for a while.
All in all, the Crimean summer of 2025 promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And Russians really need to remember, as we discussed with you back in 23, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge will be gone. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. So the Russian forces and their personnel will ultimately have to paddle out of Crimea, perhaps freestyle or breaststroke or even doggy paddle, if they absolutely do not leave now by car or by train, because those crucial routes simply will not exist anymore.
Run, run, Russians, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU's special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I are continuing our discussion about the SBU's Operation Web. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He says these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation, with the trains as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
Yes, the Americans were shocked, not because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, I think, third parties, there was a certain protection of strategic strike assets specifically provided by these treaties. Moreover, one of the primary and most significant conditions was that these aircraft had to be readily accessible for continuous monitoring by external surveillance systems, such as advanced satellites. So it turns out that the Russians, just like their American counterparts, are indeed required to park their military aircraft in designated areas that are clearly visible to the opposing side, a standard practice for transparency. But we're not adversaries. No one told Malyuk about this. He didn't read this script. Naturally, he just went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking one of them out of commission. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen to their bases as well. And their bases are wide open. Nobody's even bothered with them. If the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the Russian strategic bombers, the American strategic bombers, there aren't any of those either. And if they get serious about it, especially the Chinese, we can see how the Chinese have really taken the lead in this regard. So that's their problem. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of weapons, like drones, even a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich. Today I read a brilliant analysis by a Ukrainian woman, a patriot, on Facebook. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have destroyed this entire nuclear triad. They are simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
That's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, all these military, someone who is closely connected to military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century, is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century, right? No one nowadays remembers the sling or the boomerang. Of course, I don't mean the missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, in the last century, when rockets appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed. Nor, for example, is that same fleet that used to consume trillions of dollars. Just think how much had to be invested in all that. Trillions of dollars. And here it turns out, with his decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, Malyuk has simply crossed out this almost century-long saga of essentially the embezzlement of the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service has shown a real slap in the face to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have means of nuclear strike that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes sometimes, even then, it's not always clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a serious conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radionuclide glow that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent nuclear fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet on the nuclear topic now? Because they realized that it wasn't for nothing that a hole was made in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin? He might even grow a third head and start running around saying, you're on the right path, comrades. Well, more or less wherever it's pointed to.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information. That in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we've destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't an information operation, and it could be a Russian information operation, since they sometimes inject this kind of event into the information flow through certain dubious channels. And then if, say, the opposing side picks it up, they present it as something negative. Then they show this Kobylash, yes, and will go on to say what kind of people we supposedly are, not handling things properly. So for now, at this moment, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we treat it accordingly. Although strictly speaking, given the responsibility involved, well, Kobylash should have been made to fly. As for who will, so to speak, make him fly, or has made him, or will make him do it, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about real responsibility, Kobylash was specifically responsible for the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So, well, if not now, then later he'll have to fly. How could it be otherwise?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you again soon this week.
Goodbye.